So if you could take your Bibles and open them to Luke chapter 15, and we will be looking at these verses that Elizabeth just read, verses 11 to 32. And this is where we will be spending our time here this evening, looking at this. And as we do, what we're going to see, and what we do see in this chapter, is an answer to the accusations that the Pharisees and the scribes had been making of Jesus in verse 2. And what was this accusation? They were accusing Jesus, saying that he values people who should be seen as worth very little, at least in their culture, in their understanding, in their eyes. And so what they're doing is they're accusing Jesus of receiving sinners and eating with them, and they're accusing him as though that's a scandalous thing. Verse 1 says that all the tax gatherers and the sinners were coming near to him to listen to him, and Jesus was receiving them. He was welcoming them. In other words, he's making a place for them at his table, and he's encouraging them to stay and eat with him. Now, Luke uses this word receive 6 other times in his writings, and every time that Luke uses that word, receive, it means to eagerly await or to expect and look for. Now, the word maybe to us might sound passive, but Jesus isn't passive. He's intentionally seeking sinners and tax gatherers to come on over and sit down with him and eat with him. So what the Pharisees and the scribes are doing is accusing him of doing something spiritually unclean and even in their eyes disgusting. Now the parables in this chapter then is Jesus' explanation. This is now Jesus coming, explaining of what is really happening when he welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Now Bryce shared last week that Jesus is receiving sinners is like a shepherd who finds a lost sheep, and what does he do? When he finds them, he celebrates with his friends. And that his receiving sinners is like a woman who finds a lost coin, and what does she do? She celebrates with her friends. And in both answers, Jesus leaves no doubt about what he means, because he tells the Pharisees that the lost sheep and the lost coin represent lost sinners, and the being found represents repentance, and the celebration is what God and all the angels are doing in heaven. Now, at that very moment, some get it, others not so much. He's saying, listen, I welcome sinners because I am the incarnation of God's love pursuing the lost. That's me. He says, I'm the shepherd seeking the sheep. I'm the woman seeking her coin. And this meal that we're eating together is a little bit of what's happening in heaven right now. It's kind of like a taste of the joy that's coming. When sinners turn from their sin and accept his fellowship as the joy of their lives, what has happened is that they have now come home to God. And you see, God sees them as of immense value. And when they're found, God is glad. Okay, now in verses 11 to 32, Jesus gives now a third answer to the Pharisees' accusation. This is where we are now this evening. When he receives sinners and he eats with them, it's like a father who finds a lost son and he celebrates with all of his house. He gets the party going. All 3 parables have this in common, if you've noticed. Being lost and being found, followed by what? Great joy in heaven. A lost sheep and a found sheep and a party. A lost and a found coin and a party. A lost and found son and a party. You guessed it. You're with me. Okay, we've heard the passage from Luke 15 read this evening by Elizabeth. Thank you very much. And so let me now put a little background on to this specific parable that we're going to be looking at this evening. Now, talking about the inheritance first of all. Whenever you receive an inheritance, the timing is kind of important, don't you think? I mean, generally, except in rare circumstances, an inheritance is received after the person is dead. I mean, everybody knows that that's pretty standard practice in every culture and pretty well in every time period for the last 3,000 years at least. So it would have shocked, I think, the listeners to hear this young guy asking for his inheritance ahead of the funeral. Basically saying, "You're just taking too long to die, old man, so give me my inheritance now." Pretty callous, I would say. Now, the listeners would have fully expected, I think, the father in the story to deny the inheritance outright. Absolutely not. No way are you getting anything from me. And even to denounce the son for good measure. But instead, he gives this entitled kid the money. Which, of course, this entitled kid takes the money, leaves home, and his intention is to begin living the high life. Living the way he's always wanted to live, without being under the thumb of this old guy who should have died already by now. So he goes to this town, he goes to this other city in a foreign country, and I could just imagine all of these now wonderful friends coming out of the woodwork. All that inheritance, by the way, would have attracted, I think, a lot of attention, and they would have been more than happy to go help him spend it. Absolutely, he's my best friend. We're going to go together, and we will help you spend this money. However, what happens is he soon wastes all his money on this reckless living, on wild indulgences, and very soon he runs out of money. And I could just imagine that all of his quote-unquote friends disappearing into the night. Gone. Okay, now, he's in a foreign country, suffering at that time also. Perfect timing, a famine hits the land. So he's here suffering, not having family members close by or any familiar ties, and he's running out of friends. He ends up so desperate to survive that he feeds pigs. Apparently, it's somebody that nobody else, even in the middle of a famine, was willing to do, which today may not sound so bad, but you have to understand in that culture, at that time, to the Jewish mind, this was scandalous. Absolutely scandalous. In fact, the Jewish law stated that anyone who feeds pigs, is cursed. And get this, not only was he feeding the swine, so now he's cursed, it also appears that he may have been eating food along with the pigs because nobody was willing to help him out. All his former friends had abandoned him, and now he was at the end of his rope. We see Jesus painting quite a sad, desperate picture here, don't we? Now, in many of the Jewish people's minds, the young man was now, by this point, ruined property. He was done for. He had reached a point of no return. The life that he had known no longer existed. He had hit rock bottom. Church, I want you to understand one thing. At least one thing to remember this, that running away from God starts by feeling free, but it always ends up in utter misery. Either in this life or the one to come, or even both. Running away from God starts by feeling free, but will always end in utter misery. Now, if you have your Bibles and you have it opened up to Luke chapter 15, verse 17, notice what Jesus says here. He says, "But when he came to himself." You know what, church? When you are alienated from God, you are always alienated from yourself. You can't know yourself or relate properly to yourself if you're running from the one who made yourself for himself. You were made by God in the image of God for God. The three main things about your identity as a human being is that you were made by God, like God, for God. Therefore, really you could say that conversion then is a coming to yourself, which also includes then a coming to God. It's a discovery of where you came from and who you are and why you exist. It gives you that purpose in life that so many people look for and search for. Running from God is always a running from ourselves. And repentance then is a waking up to this truth. Back in the garden, Adam and Eve, they knew who they were. Well, they were in this beautiful, wonderful, intimate relationship with God. But, because of their disobedience, they were separated from that one relationship that had given them value, a true, full understanding of their identity, a relationship that had made them complete. And you know what? It didn't just stay with them. This separation has affected all of mankind ever since. And as a result, there was something missing in all of our lives. And so what most people do, what all of us tend to do at certain points in our lives is we try to find that missing piece with all kinds of things that just don't do it for us. Humanity continually pursues other things that leave us empty and unfulfilled. And listen, church, if we are alienated from God and we're alienated from ourselves, how in the world could we ever expect to find harmony in any kind of true, fulfilling identity, even with others? No wonder so many marriages are messed up and so many relationships broken and people calling for peace in a world that's gone crazy. But what happens when we see who we really are, alienated from God and ourselves? When we honestly recognize our hopeless situation, our condition that we have now found ourselves in, there's a humble brokenness and a compelling need to get back to the place we were meant to be all along. Which is what we see here happening in the heart and the soul of this young man, this son. He decides to go home. He came to himself and he's starting to figure this out. And so what does he do? He picks himself up, he dusts himself off, and resolves to plead. And I find this interesting, not to be taken back as a son, no, because he would have expected that to be a non-option, but rather to be allowed to, at the very least, into the lowest rank of slaves, a hired servant, men who were only day laborers. Yeah, if you were a slave, that meant that you could at least stay there on the homestead, but if you were a day laborer, okay, you could come in, give you some money, send you off on your way. So he's hoping at least to get that. He knew how far he had gone and fallen. I mean, after all, even just to be a day laborer, one more chance to see my father. You could just imagine what is going through his mind. One more day. Even for him to say no, he needed that in his life. And so he thought that this was at least way better than where he was now. Are you getting the picture with me? Do you see what must have been going on in his heart and his mind? And I can only imagine how slowly he would have traveled. He wanted to go, but he would have gone slowly. I would imagine he came very slowly with his head down and ashamed and maybe all this self-talk going on, but moving forward. He had made the decision to come home, yes, but he would have been half afraid, I can imagine. But we read this, and I love this part. We read that when his father saw him, what did the father do? He ran. He made a beeline for that boy. Now, I want you to notice something. In this culture, men wore robes. And as a result, a grown man would walk everywhere. It would have been completely undignified for a grown man, especially a man of any kind of status in any kind of community, to lift up his robes and run. You just didn't do that. Yet, you know what? His dad didn't care. He didn't care one iota about what others thought. He saw his son, and that was all that mattered to him. Everyone else disappeared in his mind. Everyone else disappeared in his sight. He had tunnel vision. He saw his boy, and he had to get to him as quick as he could. You know what? What a picture of God. When you give God an inch, he'll give you 1,000 miles, church. If you come just a little way to him when you are still a long way off, he'll run to meet you. We need to know that God will run where we might walk. We need to know that God will go and come to the places where we may be on our knees. So where we come to him so slowly, if we're walking slowly to him, he will run toward us, church. And the amazing thing is that when we return to God, no matter where we have been, our return ignites God's joy. Verse 20 says this, "And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him." What a great picture we have. When the father saw the son, he didn't delay for a moment. He started to run for his boy. And what we see here is that even though he's probably out of breath, he certainly wasn't out of love. He embraced him. That's what it tells us. He gets to him. He embraces him. He wraps him up in his arms and he kisses him. There was the son ready to confess his sin, and his father kisses him instead. And what a picture I think we have here. The son was willing to use his lips to speak a confession, and instead found that his father is willing to use his lips to kiss him. There's the son, scarcely able to think of embracing his dad. And yet his dad has barely seen him before he is embracing him completely. And I can just imagine the bear hug, holding him tight as they both wept. You know what? I see a picture of God toward us, his children. It seems like he's letting us know that he is ready to, run from the throne of heaven to embrace a repentant sinner. God embracing a sinner. What a wonderful picture. Can you imagine that? Think about this. When God's arm is about your neck and his lips are on your cheek, kissing us with gladness and joy. When that happens, church, when that really happens to us, then I think we understand more than any preacher or book or 100 stories could ever tell us about his love when we experience it for ourselves. Still, in verse 20, the father saw his son. There's a lot packed into that word saw. 3 letters, but so deep. He saw who it was. Saw where he had come from, saw the filth on his hands and on his feet and on his clothes, and he saw his rags, and he saw his repentant look. He saw what he had been. He knew. He saw where he come from. He saw what he was, but he also saw what he would soon be. His father saw him. God has a way of seeing us that you and I just can't understand it. He sees right through us at a glance. It's almost like as though we're made of glass. He sees all of our past. He sees our present. And he also sees our future. And not only does he see us, but he also sees us with these eyes filled with compassion. I remember our daughter Sydney, who she's now 25, but I remember when she was at the age of 7, we had been at Disneyland, and we were watching the light show, and she all of a sudden just disappeared during the fireworks display. And if you've ever been to Disneyland during a fireworks display right on the property, you know that there are lots and lots of people. You can barely move, and she just disappeared. One moment, she's right beside us, and the next moment, she's just gone. And so immediately, we just stopped focusing on the light. I didn't care about the light show, about these fireworks, and we began searching frantically for a little girl. It was only minutes, but I have to tell you, in my heart, church, it felt like hours looking for her. We thought we had lost her. I called out her name, Sydney, Sydney, where are you? And nobody could hear. The fireworks were going off. People were cheering. There was no way she could hear me call out for her. I asked people, I stopped them from looking up in the show, and I said, have you seen a little girl? I kept looking, I kept searching, my heart beginning to break as I could just imagine the worst. Suddenly, I saw her. She's standing there, this little girl, looking into the night sky, and she's watching the brilliant display and oblivious to the angst she had caused her mom and her dad. It seems that she had decided that she was old enough to go on her own for a little walk. She had to get a better view of the show. But you know what? When I saw her, my heart wasn't filled with rage and condemnation. Rather, you know what? My heart was filled with this Oh, this relief, this absolute joy and happiness and love and so many other great emotions because I saw someone I loved with every fiber of my being. And she was now safe with me. That's how God sees you. Multiply that by 1,000,000 times, though. And it's the same with this father. He didn't look at his returning son with these icy eyes. Love leapt into them. And as he looked at him, he had so much compassion on him. He felt deeply for him. He felt compassion because of the state that he was in, his poverty, his filth, that pale face of his son, so thin and gaunt with hunger. And it touched the father to the core of his soul. And this, church, is a picture that God has of you and me. He has compassion on us. He looks at us and sees the misfortunes and the miseries that we're experiencing. God has compassion on you, and his heart breaks for you. So, the son came home, and his father has his own very best robe put on the son. By the way, the robe symbolizes honor. He was honoring this boy. He had his ring also. He placed that on his finger. If a man gave another man his signet ring, it represented the same thing as giving him the power of eternity. He said, basically, this place is yours. And the shoes, they represented and symbolized the standing of a son and not a slave. Remember, I just want to be a day laborer. Well, the father says, absolutely not. You're my boy. And you're going to get the best shoes in this house. In that culture, the children of the family wore shoes. Forget day laborers, slaves even did not. The younger son had come home, and it was time to party, church. Time to bring on the party. You know what this parable does? It just shows us just our infinite worth in God's eyes. We are of infinite worth in God's eyes. This story represents the life of someone who had found himself in such a desperate situation that the people listening would have completely understood and accepted if the story would have ended with the rejection of the son. But instead, we see a father who is reaching out longingly to take his son back. The son came to himself, but he would have felt that he was unworthy of forgiveness. His sins were too great. Dad, you don't know what I've done. He was so obviously dirty inside and out. Yeah, Dad, you see what I look like on the outside, but don't see me on the inside, Father. He may have done things that he kept inside that he knew that if others found out, he would never be accepted again. But Dad didn't care. You're my boy. I don't care what else is going on around me. I see you. You're mine. And you're home with me. But maybe you feel like the son did. Maybe you feel like that. Maybe there are secrets in your life and you're so afraid that others might discover them and in that discovery shun you, reject you, abandon you. Are you finding that you just can't seem to get enough and that the more that the more you take, it seems like just the more you need. You're never getting satisfied. You're never getting filled up. And it's become such a vicious merry-go-round that you can't seem to step off of it. I don't know where you are today. Wherever you are today, though, church, look at the Father. The Father in the story has been watching, and he's been waiting for the Son to come home. And I could just imagine, well, he's at home every single day that boy had gone. He'd be standing out there and just scanning the horizon, looking. Surely today, this is the day he's coming home. You get up in the morning, and I don't know what they drank at that time, but I would have been there with my cup of coffee, and I would have been looking out again, scanning the horizon, because today maybe he's coming home. He didn't come yesterday, but today. The next day he would have got up, and I can imagine he's scanning, he's continually looking. And we know that this is probably the situation because we read that he saw him a long way away. When he came, he forgave him without any blame, without demanding to know what he had done to the Father. You know what? That just didn't matter. And maybe we're like the son who felt that he didn't deserve forgiveness and acceptance and the love of his father. But then when we actually stand before our Father, what we discover is that God, instead of the punishment that we deserve, does something wondrous. He forgives. And he runs to embrace us and to capture us in his arms because we belong to him. Church, we are so valuable in his eyes. You know, I know for myself, occasionally I get in this frame of mind or a mood where I allow myself to think that you know, I've messed up so many times, or that I've sinned way too much, that God's just going to give up on me and he's going to let me go. It's as if I'm expecting to hear God say to me, you know, you're too much of a mess, Steve. I've had it with you. Done. Out. And you know what? I've talked to enough people to know that all of us feel the same way some of the time. And I think it's because we too often view ourselves through the lens of our own broken natures. Just like the son in the parable. And all we see is hopeless depravity, and we can begin to assume, well, that's how God must see me as well. But we got to be reminded, we got to remember that the transformation that God has begun in us, he has promised to complete. And you know what, church? God does not lie. I'm so glad that God continues to view me through his eyes and not mine. Now, we don't want to forget another important character in the story, the older son. I wish I had time to unpack all the cool stuff about the way the father treats the older brothers well, but we don't have enough time tonight. So I just want to dip into it so you can kind of get a feel of what's there and get a few little nuggets out of it. As the older son is coming in from the fields, he hears this music. He's wondering what's going on. So he calls up one of the other servants and he gets this report that his brothers return home safely and that a party's going on. So what's the brother's response to this? Of course, he's all excited. Yay, I get to see my younger brother. I can pick on him again. No, he gets mad. He becomes angry. And he refuses to join the party. He's going to stay outside. I don't know if you knew this, but him doing that action of staying outside and not joining the party is a severe insult to his father. Because what it's doing is it humiliates him. Now, by the way, a second time in front of the whole village, because the older son role at a party was to welcome all of the guests. With him not at the party, everybody will know that he's rejected his father. Now, if you read further, you find that in his heart, the older son has distanced himself as much from his father as the younger son had. He says to his father, look, listen, all these years I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed you once, Dad. Yeah, you never even gave me a goat so I could celebrate with my friends. There's a couple of statements here that tip us off to the older son's distance from his father. First, does he think of himself as a son? No. Not according to this. He's been slaving for his father. He hasn't lived with him like a son, but in his mind's eye, he's been living with his father like a servant, like a slave. Secondly, he's mad because the father had never given him an animal to throw a party with his friends. So he's feeling deprived by the father because the father had never given him anything, like no calf, not even a chicken. No goat certainly. But what happened when the younger son originally left? We read this at the beginning of the chapter. The older son also got his share of the inheritance, by the way. That's why the father says, now in verse 31, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. Hey, I've already given it to you. All these years, it's already been yours. Everything here is yours. Well, the older son had distanced himself, and he refuses to join the father at the party. So what does the father do? The father does the same thing he did for his younger son. He humiliates himself by leaving the party and going out to his older son. See the heart of the father in this story? In the first part, a son is far off, but in the end, he's found. In the second part, the son is far off, but in the end, what does he do? And that's the question that now Jesus poses to the Pharisees after telling them about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and now the lost son. They got it. They got what Jesus was alluding to here. Clearly in their minds, they were the older sons. They were the ones who had stayed around, tried to obey, and serve God like slaves. They were the ones that were trying to follow the law and make themselves look good in front of the Father. But in their hearts, they were far, far off. They didn't want to come to the party and celebrate the return of wayward sons who squandered their living in foreign lands. No way. They didn't want to be near the Father who, it appears, received the scum of the earth. They saw themselves better than anyone else and so didn't need the Father's grace in their minds. And Jesus is saying to them, listen, the younger son understands and accepts that he was far off and he has been found. He admits that he was lost. The Father comes out to him and outrageously welcomes him back into the home. Well, the older son is far off too. But he's proud. He's proud because he knows he's really not all that bad of a guy. Not like the younger son. Yet the Father wants him back in fellowship too. Why do you think the Father went out to see him? He wants him back too. What a picture we have of a God who, despite his majesty and his holiness and universal power and his greatness, astonishingly cares for all of us as individual beings, one at a time. Have you thought about that? Last week, we saw that there was one sheep out of 100 and one coin out of 10. And this evening, we saw a son who ran away. Now, here's the point. God has a universe to run and galaxies to uphold and atomic particles to manage and governments to rule. Yet, listen to this, yet you don't hear the Bible saying that all of heaven rejoices over the orbits of the stars or the rise of kings. You don't. It's true, that God takes pleasure in all that he does. That part's true. But Jesus is clearly referring to something special in these parables, and it's this. When one sinner repents, there is special joy in heaven. You are of infinite worth in God's eyes, church. And he wants, so much, he wants this intimacy with you. Christ has done all the hard work, by the way, at the cross to make it possible. All he requires is that you believe in him and accept his offer of forgiveness and restoration. You see, Luke 15 is really all about the love of God stepping into the cities and the suburbs of our world to find lost sons and daughters. It's about God sitting beside us when we feel the lowest and even the dirtiest and the most lost and alone. And he's putting his arm around us and he's telling us, oh, you're of immense worth. You are so special to me. It's about God coming to us and telling us the truth that we're not good enough to make things right with God on our own. It won't work. It can't work. And the point of these parables is not that we simply just then look and copy Jesus. To receive sinners and eat with them. We can do that, but that's not the point of the parable, to find lost sheep and find lost coins and to find sons and bring them home to their dads. The point of these parables, church, is to see Jesus. Jesus didn't end these parables with go and do likewise, and Luke didn't end this chapter with go and imitate Jesus. The point of these parables is to have us look at Jesus, to consider Jesus, to know Jesus, to learn what kind of person it is you say you trust and love and worship, to soak in the shadow of Jesus, to just saturate your soul with the ways of Jesus, to watch him, to listen to him, to stand in awe of him, to let him overwhelm you with the way he is. And if we would be so permeated with the beauty of this risky, painful, sacrificial, loving way of life, I don't think we could help but not pursue it. Wherever you are tonight, decide to come home and repent of your disobedience. Come in from the field and rest in his righteousness and not your own. Come in from wherever you are today and sit at the table with the Father and be restored, be refreshed, and church, be renewed.